When you are 15 years old, you do not have a lot of options for making money. You are too young to get a regular job at a grocery store or a fast food restaurant because of labor laws. So, back when I was 15, I was always looking for any odd job I could find to make some extra cash. Mostly I would do things like mowing lawns, raking leaves, or babysitting for people my parents knew. It was usually neighbors or family friends who needed someone to watch their kids for a few hours on a weekend. It was easy money, and since my parents knew the families, everyone felt safe. But one afternoon during my summer break, I was sitting at the computer browsing through Craigslist, looking for any quick gigs. That was when I saw an ad that caught my eye. The ad was written by a woman who was looking for an overnight babysitter. She explained in the post that she worked late-night shifts and needed someone to stay at her house with her 6-year-old daughter, whose name was Rose. According to the listing, Rose would already be asleep by the time the babysitter arrived, and she would sleep through the entire night. This meant the job would basically consist of sitting on the couch, watching television, and sleeping. The best part was the pay. It was surprisingly high for what sounded like the easiest job in the world. I immediately sent an email to the woman, and about an hour later, I got a response. She asked for my phone number so we could talk. She called me that evening, and when I answered, she sounded completely normal. She was calm, friendly, and answered all of my questions without hesitating. She told me that she had to leave for her shift before I would arrive at the house, so she was going to hide a house key outside for me. She gave me the exact details of where the key would be hidden near the porch. However, because I was only 15, my mom was not about to let me go to a stranger's house without checking things out first. My mom insisted on speaking to the woman herself. They ended up talking on the phone for several minutes. I do not know exactly what they discussed, but whatever the woman said, it was enough to satisfy my mom. After she hung up, my mom turned to me and said it sounded like a great opportunity. The job was scheduled for the very next night, starting at around 9:30 in the evening. When the time came the next night, my mom drove me over to the address. The house was located in a very quiet residential neighborhood about 20 minutes away from our home. It was situated near the very end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall, thick trees that blocked out a lot of the moonlight. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed that every single light inside the house was turned on. It looked incredibly bright from the outside. My mom kept the car running and waited in the driveway while I walked up to the front porch. I checked the exact hiding spot the woman had described on the phone, and sure enough, the key was right there. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and set my backpack down on the floor. I turned around and waved to my mom to let her know I was safe. She waved back, backed out of the driveway, and drove away. At that point, I was completely alone. The house was dead quiet. I assumed that little Rose was already fast asleep in her room, just like her mother had said she would be. At first glance, the house looked like a perfectly normal family home. There were framed family photos hanging on the walls, and a few children's toys were scattered near the living room couch. I noticed a pink backpack leaning against a chair near the entryway, and there were several colorful children's drawings attached to the refrigerator with magnets. Everything seemed totally ordinary. Still, since I was going to be spending the night there, I wanted to get familiar with the layout of the house. I decided to take a quick walk through the first floor. The kitchen connected to a long hallway that led towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right side. I was expecting to see an empty guest room or a study. What I actually saw made my heart skip a beat. There was a man standing inside the room. He was facing the window, staring intently out into the darkness. This was incredibly unsettling because it was pitch black outside. There were no outdoor lights on, and there was absolutely nothing to look at but a black reflection. I stood there, completely frozen, staring at him for several seconds. Finally, I managed to find my voice and spoke up, asking if someone was there. The very second I made a sound, the man spun around to face me. The first thing I noticed about him was his expression. He was wearing a wide, intense smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth was completely missing. I asked him who he was, but his smile never changed, and he did not say a word. He just stood there, staring at me with that blank, wide grin. I slowly backed out of the doorway, keeping my eyes on him. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and immediately called the woman who had hired me. She answered after a few rings, and I quickly explained with a shaking voice that there was a stranger standing in one of the bedrooms. She was silent for a second, sounding confused, but then she suddenly let out a small laugh, as if she had just remembered something. That sudden shift in her voice is something that still sticks with me to this day. She told me not to worry and explained that the man was actually her brother. She said he suffered from dementia and sometimes wandered around the house at night. She assured me that he was completely harmless and that I had nothing to worry about. But that explanation did not make me feel any better. If her brother lived in the house, that was something she definitely should have mentioned in her Craigslist ad or during our phone calls. Before she hung up, she told me to help myself to any food in the fridge and said I could sleep in the guest room at the end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood in the middle of the house, trying to process what was happening. I was incredibly uncomfortable, but I did not want to react too quickly and look foolish. I decided to walk down the rest of the hallway to find the guest room. As I walked, I passed the open door where the man had been standing. He was no longer visible from the doorway, which made me even more nervous. I kept walking down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I walked up to the first door and turned the knob. It was locked. I tried the second door. It was locked too. I tried the third door, and it was also locked. When I reached the 4th door, I turned the handle, and it opened about 3 inches before hitting something and stopping. I peeked through the small crack. The room was dark, and I could not see much, but it appeared to be completely empty. I pushed the door a little harder, but it would not open any wider. It was just a cold, empty room. I felt stupid for being so paranoid, so I shrugged it off and continued toward the guest room at the very end of the hall. But as I walked back toward the kitchen to get some water, I stopped near the refrigerator. I looked closely at the children's drawings hanging there. This time, I noticed something strange. The drawings looked extremely old. The edges of the paper had turned yellow and brittle. One of the drawings actually had a thick layer of dust sitting on top of the magnet that was holding it in place. I looked over at the pink backpack by the chair, and I realized that the fabric was faded and worn out. A terrible thought crawled into my mind. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually lived in this house was. I had been there for almost half an hour, and I had not heard a single sound from a 6-year-old child. I had not seen a child's bedroom that was actually open, and there were no recent toys or items anywhere. It felt like a stage play designed to look like a family home, but everything was decades old. I walked quickly back to the guest room at the end of the hallway. It was a very small, plain room with just a bed and a dresser. As I stepped inside, I looked at the door. There was no lock on it. I turned around to look back down the long hallway, and my breath caught in my throat. The man was standing at the far end of the hall again. He was staring directly at me, and that same wide, toothless smile slowly spread across his face. I had not heard him walk down the hall. There were no footsteps, no creaking floorboards. It was as if he had just materialized out of thin air. I do not know how long he had been standing there, watching me in silence. We stared at each other down the dark hallway. I was looking at him with pure terror, while he looked at me as if I were some kind of curiosity. I quickly stepped into the guest room, closed the door, and stood against it. I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to force myself to calm down. When I was younger, my great-grandmother had passed away after struggling with dementia. Because of that, I knew how confusing and difficult the condition could be. I tried to use that knowledge to justify the man's behavior. I told myself he was just a confused older man who did not know what he was doing. But deep down, my instincts were screaming at me that something was terribly wrong. I could not shake the feeling of danger. I pulled out my phone and called my mom. It rang, and I had to call her 3 times before she finally answered. I explained everything to her in a whispered, panicked voice. I told her about the unannounced brother with dementia, the locked bedroom doors, the dusty, ancient children's drawings, and the fact that I had not seen or heard any sign of the little girl Rose. For a few moments, my mom was completely silent on the other end of the line. Then, her voice completely changed. She told me to stay exactly where I was, and said she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing my mom say those words made me feel a wave of relief, but it also terrified me. If my mom was this worried, then my fears were not just in my head. Something was seriously wrong. She told me she would drive as fast as she could and hung up. A few minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. They were slow and deliberate. I sat completely still on the bed, holding my breath. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped directly outside my bedroom door. Everything went dead silent. I stared at the doorknob, waiting to see if it would start to turn. I checked my phone to see if the woman had called me back to check on things, but there were no missed calls. I decided to try calling her myself. I called her 3 times, but it went straight to voicemail every single time. While I was holding the phone to my ear, I heard a soft click. I looked up and saw that the bedroom door was slowly opening. It stopped after opening just a few inches. The crack was not wide enough for me to see who was standing on the other side. I sat there, paralyzed, staring at the dark opening. The door remained cracked open, but whoever was standing out there did not make a move to come inside. I knew it had to be the brother, or whoever that man really was. In those tense, quiet seconds, I decided that I was not going to wait around to find out what he wanted. I quietly got off the bed, grabbed my backpack, and moved toward the window. I unlocked it, forced the frame upward, and climbed out. I dropped down into the dark backyard, landing on the grass, and I did not stop running. I ran around the side of the house, reached the street, and kept sprinting. I did not look back. I ran nearly a block away before I finally slowed down to catch my breath under a street lamp. I pulled out my phone to call my mom and tell her where I was. But before I could even dial her number, a text message popped up on my screen. It was from the woman's phone number. The message was incredibly short. It just asked, "Where are you going?" My stomach dropped. I immediately spun around and looked back down the street toward the house. I could not see anyone standing outside. I had not seen any security cameras when I walked up to the front porch, yet somehow, she knew the exact moment I had run out of the house. That was the moment I became absolutely convinced that I had escaped a very dangerous situation. I called my mom and told her not to drive up to the house. I gave her my location a block away and told her to pick me up there. About 10 minutes later, her car headlights appeared. She pulled up and I jumped into the front seat, immediately locking the doors behind me. We drove away as fast as we could, and neither of us ever tried to contact that woman again. To this day, I have no idea who that smiling man really was. I do not know if a little girl named Rose ever existed, or why all the bedroom doors in that house were locked shut. There is a very small, highly unlikely possibility that it was all just a series of weird misunderstandings, and that I was just a paranoid teenager who ran away from a legitimate job. But deep down, I know the chances of that are close to 0. Something deeply disturbing was happening in that house. That terrifying experience changed the way I looked at strange houses and online job postings forever. But as it turned out, it was not the only time I would find myself working in a place that felt completely wrong. A year or so later, when I was 15 or 16, I managed to get a summer job cleaning out vacant units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through a local property manager whom I used to babysit for. For a high school student, the pay was surprisingly good, and the work itself was very straightforward. Whenever a tenant moved out of one of the condos, our job was to go inside and clean the entire unit from top to bottom so it would be ready for the next family to move in. A lot of the units we worked on had been abandoned in a massive hurry. People would get evicted or just pack up and slip away in the middle of the night. Because of this, many of the apartments were filled with left-behind belongings. In some places, it looked as if the families had simply gotten up in the middle of a meal and walked out, leaving clothes, toys, and half-eaten food behind. One day, I was assigned to work alongside a university student named Jen. Jen was about 20 or 21 years old, so she was older than me and naturally took charge of the work while I followed her lead. On this particular afternoon, we were assigned to clean a unit that was located at the very end of a row of condos. The physical layout of this specific unit is very important to understand what happened next. When you first walked through the front door, you entered directly into a small living room. Immediately on your right side, there were 2 sets of stairs. One set of stairs led up to the second floor where the bedrooms were. Right next to those stairs was a heavy wooden door that opened to another staircase leading down into the basement. The basement stairs turned twice at sharp angles, which meant that if you were standing on the main floor, you could not see down into the basement at all. The basement itself was just one large, unfinished concrete room. It contained a washer, a dryer, a furnace, and a single, bare light bulb hanging from a wire in the center of the ceiling. There were no closets, no side rooms, no alcoves, and absolutely nowhere for a person to hide. It was just a cold, open concrete box. When Jen and I first unlocked the front door and entered the unit, it was obvious that the previous tenants had left in an extreme rush. The kitchen was absolutely filthy, covered in grease and old food, and almost all of their personal belongings were still scattered throughout the rooms. We spent the first few hours of the afternoon packing all of their old clothes and trash into heavy black garbage bags, sorting out what could be donated and what had to be thrown away. Once the heavy lifting was done, we began the actual cleaning. Part of cleaning the kitchen involved pulling the heavy oven and the refrigerator away from the walls so we could scrub the dust and grime behind them. We also pulled out the metal storage drawer that sat underneath the oven. However, when we tried to slide the drawer back into its slot, we realized that the metal guide rails were badly bent and damaged. The drawer just would not slide back in properly. For reasons that seemed logical to us at the time, Jen and I decided to stand on opposite sides of the drawer and kick it with our shoes until it finally wedged itself back underneath the oven. It made a loud, echoing metal screech, and we confirmed that it was completely jammed in place. We tried to pull it out again, but it would not budge. It was totally stuck. We both regretted doing it because we knew we had probably broken it further, but we figured we would just let the property manager deal with it later. After that, we decided to split up to get the work done faster. Jen took her cleaning supplies and headed upstairs to clean the bedrooms, while I stayed downstairs to remove the glass light fixtures from the ceilings so I could wash them in the kitchen sink. I was standing near the top of a small stepladder in the middle of the living room when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I stopped what I was doing and called back to her, asking what she needed. There was no answer. I climbed down the ladder and walked up the stairs to the second floor. When I found Jen, she was scrubbing a bedroom floor with her headphones firmly over her ears. I tapped her on the shoulder and asked her what she wanted. She looked up at me, completely confused, and asked what I was talking about. I told her that she had just called my name. She laughed, shook her head, and said she had not said a word and had been listening to music the whole time. I figured I was just hearing things, so I shrugged it off and went back downstairs. Now, there was one specific feature of this condo that had been making me uncomfortable all afternoon. Directly above the staircase leading to the second floor, there was an attic access panel in the ceiling. It was just a square opening that led into a dark, empty crawl space. The wooden cover for the hole was completely missing. Every single time I had to walk up or down the stairs, I had to pass directly underneath this open square of pitch-black darkness, and I constantly found myself looking up into it, feeling an irrational sense of dread. A few minutes after I went back downstairs to the kitchen, I heard my name being called again. The voice was clear and distinct, but this time, before I could even call back, Jen yelled down from the top of the stairs. She told me she had not called my name and joked that I was officially hearing things. At the time, I laughed and agreed with her. It was a strange sensation, but I was not truly frightened yet. I went back to the kitchen sink and began washing the dusty glass light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge from the counter, and I almost tripped over something on the floor. I looked down, and my heart stopped. The metal oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the linoleum floor. I stood there, staring at it in disbelief. Jen and I had kicked that drawer so hard that it was wedged solid under the oven frame. We had both tested it, and it had been completely immovable. Yet now, it was slid open perfectly. I knew Jen had not come downstairs because I would have seen her walk past the kitchen entry. I walked over to the drawer and kicked it hard, trying to force it back in. It took several heavy impacts before the metal finally screeched and wedged itself back under the stove. To be absolutely sure, I grabbed the metal handle and pulled with all my strength. It did not budge. It was completely stuck again. Satisfied, I turned back to the sink and resumed washing the glass. But just a few minutes later, I turned around to set a wet fixture down, and I almost tripped again. The drawer was pulled halfway out on the floor again. I had not heard a single sound. There was nobody else downstairs with me. This time, a cold wave of genuine unease washed over me. The drawer had not just slid out on its own. The damaged rails meant it required physical force to move, and someone or something had silently pulled it out while my back was turned. I decided to leave the drawer exactly where it was and let the property manager handle it. I walked to the stairs and checked on Jen. She was still busy cleaning the master bedroom upstairs, so I returned to my work. I started reinstalling the clean glass fixtures on the ceiling. Since it was a bright, sunny summer afternoon, the natural light coming through the windows was plenty to see by, so I turned off the wall switches while I worked on the wiring. I was standing near the top of the ladder, carefully trying to secure one of the heavy glass domes, when the overhead light suddenly switched on, blinding me. The sudden, intense brightness startled me so badly that I lost my balance. I fell backward off the ladder, crashing hard onto the living room floor. A split second later, the heavy glass fixture slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor right next to my head, throwing sharp shards of glass everywhere. I sat on the floor, stunned and aching, looking over at the light switch. I had a clear view of the wall, and there was absolutely nobody near the switch. At the exact same time, I could hear the distinct sound of Jen's footsteps moving around directly above me on the second floor. There was no physical way she could have run down the stairs, flipped the switch, and sprinted back upstairs in the 1 second it took for me to fall. The switch had moved on its own. I was not thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural, but I was incredibly uncomfortable. I decided I was done working by myself. I climbed the stairs and found Jen in the bedroom. When I told her what had just happened, her face fell, and she looked genuinely uneasy. She looked at me and confessed something she had not wanted to tell me earlier. A few minutes before I fell, she thought she had heard someone call her name too, and she knew for a fact that the voice did not sound like mine. We were both officially terrified. We wanted to finish the job as quickly as possible so we could leave. The very last task on our list was to sweep the concrete floor in the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down into that dark basement alone, so we agreed to go down together. We walked down the turning wooden stairs into the cold concrete room, while Jen grabbed the broom and began sweeping the dust into a pile. I sat on top of the clothes dryer, talking to her to keep our minds off the creepy atmosphere. Within a few minutes, she was finished. We headed back up the stairs, feeling an immense sense of relief that the job was finally over. We stood in the living room near the front door, gathering our cleaning supplies and packing our things. I was standing about 2 feet away from the open basement door when it happened. From deep down in the dark basement, we heard the unmistakable sound of heavy, solid footsteps walking across the concrete floor. Both of us froze mid-sentence, our eyes locked onto each other. The sound was so loud and distinct that there was no denying what we were hearing. But then, the situation went from creepy to absolutely terrifying. The heavy footsteps suddenly broke into a full sprint. We heard the rapid, heavy thudding of someone running across the basement floor, and then the footsteps began charging up the wooden stairs toward us at incredible speed. The sound was deafening, getting louder and closer with every passing microsecond. I looked at Jen, and all the color had drained from her face. She was completely white. Running on pure, primal instinct, I reached out, grabbed the handle of the basement door, and slammed it shut with all my strength. The second the door latched, Jen and I turned and sprinted out the front door. We flew across the front lawn, running as fast as our legs could carry us. At one point, Jen screamed behind me, asking about the key to the unit. I yelled back at her to leave it, and we did not stop running until we were on the completely opposite side of the condo complex. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. Eventually, we walked back to the property manager's office and told her that we believed someone was hiding inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and told her we were done for the day. As far as I know, she called the police to inspect the condo before anyone else went inside. Jen and I never told her what we had actually experienced in that house. It just sounded too ridiculous to say out loud. Who would believe us if we said an invisible force had called our names, moved heavy appliances, shattered light fixtures, and chased us up the basement stairs? I am still a skeptic about most paranormal things. I always look for a logical, mechanical explanation for strange events. Maybe we imagined hearing our names because we were nervous. Maybe there was some bizarre defect in the stove that caused the drawer to slide out. Maybe the electrical wiring was faulty, causing the light switch to flip. But I cannot explain the basement. The basement was a completely empty concrete box, with nowhere for a human to hide, and those running footsteps were not distant or quiet. They sounded exactly like a heavy person sprinting up the stairs directly toward us. More than 20 years later, whenever I hear the sound of someone running up a wooden staircase, I am instantly transported back to that hot summer afternoon. As terrifying as that condo was, it taught me that some places hold secrets that we are simply not meant to understand. But the most dangerous situations do not always involve invisible forces. Sometimes the real danger comes from real people and from our own willingness to ignore the warning signs because we do not want to cause a scene. A few years after the condo incident, when I was a bit older, I found myself in another situation that nearly cost me my life. At the time, I was still a young hustler, always looking for ways to make quick money. My mom knew an elderly couple from her local church group who owned a large rural property about 40 minutes away from our house. Their names were Richard and Elaine. They were both in their late 60s, which was old, but they were still active and mobile. They lived in an old farmhouse situated at the end of a very long, winding gravel driveway, surrounded by dense woods. The deal they offered was simple. I would stay at their farmhouse for a little over a week and help Richard with various tasks around the property. I would help him clear out the garage, do heavy yard work, paint a wooden fence, and move some heavy furniture. In exchange, they would pay me a very generous lump sum of cash at the end of the week. My mom trusted them completely because she had known Richard for many years, and when I first met Elaine, she seemed like the sweetest grandmotherly figure you could imagine. She smiled constantly, spoke softly, and kept asking if I was hungry. The farmhouse was beautiful in an old-fashioned way. My bedroom was located at the very end of a long hallway on the second floor. On my first day there, Richard took me around the property to show me what we would be working on, and Elaine made a wonderful dinner for us. But during that first dinner, I noticed something slightly unusual. Elaine did not talk very much, and she kept a very neutral, almost blank smile on her face. Over the course of the meal, she asked me what my name was 3 different times. Each time, Richard would quickly step in and say that she was just getting a little forgetful in her old age. I assumed it was just normal, mild old age forgetfulness, so I did not think much of it and went to bed around 11 o'clock. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I lay completely still in the dark, listening. The old floorboards outside my door creaked under the weight of someone walking. I figured Richard was just getting up to use the restroom, but the footsteps did not go toward the bathroom. They just walked slowly back and forth, right outside my door. They would walk down the hallway, turn around, and walk back. This went on for about 10 minutes, and the repetition started to make me incredibly uncomfortable. Eventually, the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I stared at the wide gap at the bottom of the door, and in the dim light, I could clearly see the dark outline of 2 feet standing right there, facing my room. After a long, silent minute, the shadow finally moved away, and the footsteps retreated down the hall. The next morning, while Richard and I were outside clearing brush, I casually mentioned the nighttime footsteps to him. He did not look surprised at all. He just sighed and explained that Elaine often wandered the house at night because she suffered from bad dreams and would get confused. He told me not to worry about it. When I asked if I could lock my bedroom door at night, he let out a dry laugh and said that because the farmhouse was so old, the guest room door did not have a lock. I decided to try and let it go, but the second night was much worse. I woke up at the exact same time, around 3 in the morning, to the sound of those same footsteps, but this time they were moving much faster. I could hear Elaine muttering rapidly to herself in the hallway. I could not understand most of what she was saying, but then I distinctly heard her whisper my name. A cold chill ran down my spine. I watched her shadow pass back and forth under the gap beneath my door. Suddenly, the brass doorknob began to turn. It twisted slowly, stopped, and the door creaked open about an inch. Through the tiny crack, I heard a low, raspy, whispering voice. I could not make out the words, but the tone was incredibly hostile. A second later, the door was gently clicked shut again, I did not sleep for the rest of that night. The next morning, I confronted Richard and told him exactly what had happened. Once again, he tried to downplay the situation. He told me that Elaine probably just thought the guest room was empty, and that her confusion had been getting worse lately. He looked embarrassed and asked me not to bring it up in front of her because it would upset her. During the day, Elaine seemed completely normal again. She made us lunch, folded laundry, and watered her plants. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room. She was not wearing her sweet smile anymore. She was giving me a flat, cold, highly suspicious look, as if she had no idea who I was, and hated the fact that I was in her house. On my 4th day there, Richard and I were cleaning out an old metal shed behind the house. While moving some boxes, I found a dented metal walker shoved into a dark corner. Right next to it was a shattered picture frame, and the glass was covered in dark, dried brown stains. Later that afternoon, when I went inside to use the bathroom, I noticed a long, deep scratch on the hallway wall at chest height, as if something sharp had been forcefully dragged across the plaster. I also noticed several small, jagged holes in one of the downstairs doors, looking like someone had repeatedly struck the wood with a heavy object. These looked like unmistakable signs of a physical struggle. That night, I decided to take precautions. I took my heavy suitcase and wedged it firmly in front of my bedroom door. It was not enough to stop a determined intruder, but I knew it would make a loud scraping sound if anyone tried to push the door open. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the loud, harsh sound of plastic scraping across the wooden floorboards. I sat up instantly. My bedroom door was pushed halfway open. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the dim hallway light, was Elaine. She was wearing a long white nightgown, and her mouth was hanging wide open as she breathed heavily. I tried to stay calm and quietly spoke her name, but she did not seem to hear me. She stepped into my room, and that was when I saw what she was holding in her right hand. It was a long, sharp kitchen knife. She walked slowly toward the side of my bed, her eyes fixed on me. She began to whisper over and over again that I did not belong here. Her voice was cold and venomous. She came right up to the edge of my mattress, standing over me with the knife hanging loosely at her side. Terrified, I screamed for Richard as loud as I could. The sudden deafening noise made Elaine flinch. She blinked, as if suddenly waking up, and then turned around and marched stiffly out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Richard came running up the stairs about 30 seconds later. He looked incredibly annoyed, as if I had woken him up over nothing. I was shaking, and I told him that Elaine had just stood over my bed with a kitchen knife. He shook his head and kept repeating that she would never actually hurt anyone, and that she just got confused at night. At that point, I was furious. I told him I wanted to go home immediately. Richard looked at the clock and pointed out that it was 3 in the morning, and my mother was undoubtedly asleep. He promised we would talk about it first thing in the morning and urged me to get some rest. I should have called my mom right then and there, but I was young and did not want to cause a massive scene in the middle of the night. As soon as Richard left, I pushed my heavy wooden dresser directly in front of the door and stayed awake, staring at the window until the sun came up. The next morning, Elaine was standing at the stove making pancakes, smiling and acting like the sweet grandmother again. Richard pulled me aside in the hallway and apologized, but his apology felt empty and forced. He confessed that Elaine's memory had been deteriorating rapidly. I asked him point blank if she had ever attacked anyone before. He hesitated, took a long pause, and then admitted that she had once gotten upset with a professional caregiver, but claimed the situation had been handled. That was when I realized he had been lying to me and hiding the truth from the very beginning. I told him again that I was leaving. He said he understood, but pointed out that my mom was at work until late that evening. He proposed that I stay for one last afternoon to finish up our final task, and then he would personally drive me home and pay me my full wages the next morning. That afternoon, while Richard was outside making a phone call, I went into the laundry room to find my backpack so I could start packing my things early. When I picked it up, my heart dropped. There was a large, dark red bloodstain smeared across the front pocket of the canvas bag. I immediately walked outside, called Richard into the room, and demanded to know what had happened to my bag. Richard looked at the bag, and for the first time, I saw a flash of real anger on his face. He grabbed the backpack from my hands and told me that he had accidentally cut his finger earlier in the day and must have smeared blood on it while moving it out of the way. He told me to stop worrying and to go back to work. I told him I was calling my mom right now. I went up to my room and tried to make the call, but the signal in the rural area was terrible, and the call failed twice. I tried to text her, but the message would not send, and Richard refused to give me the password to their home internet. I felt completely trapped. I realized I had no choice but to wait it out until the next morning. When night fell, I did not even bother getting under the covers. I sat on top of the bed, fully dressed with my shoes tightly laced and my packed backpack sitting right next to me. I pushed the heavy dresser back in front of the door, but around midnight, I heard a knock. It was Richard. He told me through the door that I needed to move the dresser away from the entrance because it was a major safety hazard in case of a fire. I refused, but then, for the first time since I had arrived, Richard lost his temper. He shouted at me, ordering me to move the dresser immediately. Not wanting to escalate things further, I complied. I pushed the dresser just far enough so the door could open, and then I sat back down on the bed, holding my phone in my hand, waiting in the dark. Around 2 in the morning, the quiet of the house was shattered. I heard Elaine downstairs, and she was not whispering anymore. She was screaming at the top of her lungs. I heard the loud crash of breaking glass, followed by Richard's voice trying to calm her down. Then, there was a heavy, sickening thud, followed by a loud cry of pain from Richard. It sounded like she had just violently attacked him. I sprang from the bed and cracked my bedroom door open. The hallway was pitch black, but I could see light spilling from the staircase downstairs. Then I heard the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps starting to climb the stairs. I slammed my bedroom door shut and threw my entire body weight against the wooden dresser, shoving it back in front of the door. A few seconds later, something heavy slammed into the outside of my door. The brass doorknob began to rattle violently back and forth. Elaine was on the other side, and she was screaming that I did not belong in her house. The door shook on its hinges as she threw her weight against it again and again. Suddenly, I heard a sharp, metallic strike against the wood, and a large splinter of my door flew inward. She was hacking at the door with some kind of weapon. I looked over at the window. It was my only way out. I could hear Richard downstairs, groaning in pain and calling out for her. I knew that whatever she had just done to him, she was going to do to me if she got through that door. I ran to the window, unlocked it, and pushed the frame open as hard as I could. I kicked out the window screen and looked down. Fortunately, there was a small wooden roof over the front porch directly below my window. I grabbed my backpack, climbed out onto the sill, and dropped down onto the shingles. Behind me, the sound of Elaine hacking at my bedroom door was getting louder. I scrambled to the edge of the porch roof and jumped, dropping through the air and landing hard in the bushes below. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the scratches on my arms, and ran down the gravel driveway. As I ran, I heard the heavy front door of the farmhouse fling open behind me. I glanced back and saw Elaine standing on the porch under the outdoor light. She was holding a heavy iron fireplace poker in her hand, screaming into the night. I did not stop. I ran all the way down the road until I finally got a strong cell signal and dialed 911. The police and an ambulance arrived about 15 minutes later. They found Richard downstairs in the farmhouse. He had a deep, bleeding gash on his head and a fractured wrist from trying to defend himself against Elaine. She was found wandering near the edge of the woods, still clutching the fireplace poker, and was taken away by the paramedics. The police contacted my mom, who drove down as fast as she could to pick me up. Richard later admitted to my mom that Elaine's condition had been severely worsening for months, but he had refused to put her in a specialized care facility because he felt incredibly guilty. He truly believed he could manage her violent outbursts on his own. He also confessed that she had violently attacked 2 professional caregivers before me, which was why no local nursing agencies would send anyone to their house anymore. When my mom heard that, she was so angry I thought she was going to hit him. I still think about that week at the farmhouse, and how many clear warning signs I chose to ignore, simply because I did not want to cause trouble or seem dramatic. It made me realize that as human beings, we often try to hold on to the hope that everything is normal, even when our instincts are screaming at us that we are in danger. We don't see the trap until it is almost too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.